So I had something to say about the concept of proof, because that comes up a lot on the show. And I think really proof is not, I think it's kind of out of place somewhat in these discussions, in the sense that proof is not really, I don't think, particularly useful for a lot of life decisions.
I think if you listen to the show regularly, you probably hear us using terms like evidence instead of proof most of the time.
Exactly.
And I think when people call in, it's usually the callers who are saying, "I can prove God exists."
Yeah, I think that the history of apologetics and that sort of thing, it lends itself to the kind of the idea that there's these proofs, arguments, the cosmological argument, or various. And I think people should keep in mind that that's not how proofs are better for things that are where you set up the rules in advance, like mathematics, where you can have postulates and you don't have to establish those. You can just set them. You don't have to prove them.
I think I kind of agree with you. In fact, like I've often made the observation that proofs of God, like the first cause argument or whatever, tend to be not so much scientific demonstrations in terms of trying to observe the real world and make sense of what you see there, but just proofs in a vacuum where you try to fiddle around with your definitions until they say a thing that you like, and they would continue to be just as valid or not valid regardless of anything that you actually observed out there. Like people try to say, oh yes, everything has to have a cause, and then they try to make sort of a logical argument that that kind of does an end run around the need to observe things that support what you're trying to demonstrate.
Yeah, and I think atheists too, if they're educated on the topic, aren't trying to. You can't prove a negative, and they're not trying to prove that there's not a God. They're, looking at it from the opposite direction of, putting the burden of proof on the other person, on the opposing argument that there is a God.
Yeah, that does happen a lot.
Yeah. So, but I do think that you still have to, I don't think religious people should be discouraged as long as they shouldn't be discouraged by the fact they can't make a proof. I mean, I think that they should, you've got to look at the evidence. You've got to try to be honest, and then you have to be honest that you are looking at all the evidence and that you're taking an argument.
Yeah, but I think
seriously.
here's where we maybe do differ a little bit, which is that I think that theists tend to have extremely low standards for arriving at the conclusions that they want to arrive at. Like, for instance, I've had a lot of conversations with theists where they'll fall back on either, well, that's just my faith, or the Bible says it and therefore it's true. And I think those are both real flimsy reasons to hang on to a specific position, especially faith, which is, to my mind, basically an admission that I have no reason whatsoever to believe in this thing, but I really want to, and so I'm going to stick to it. And I think that in a lot of cases when theists talk about things like evidence, the conversations that often follow are just them basically flailing around to fit something that we do know is real, and say, oh, and therefore because of that, I say God exists.
Yeah. Right.
I would actually love for more Christians, like kind of what he was saying, to start taking a look more so at the evidence and being honest about it with themselves. That's what kind of led me out of being a theist, it was researching old copies of the Bible and looking at the site where I could switch translation, like even if I isolate a single verse, go to a different translation to see what that verse was in another book, that type of thing. And I thought it was fascinating when I was looking at that because I saw how much change was happening over time.
Sure.
And that's what led me to start questioning, well, the book that I've grown up with, the King James Version specifically, is what I was
It's like one of the least reliable translations in a way.
That's all we had in our church. Gosh. But it started recognizing that there was differences there is what kind of led me out, and being honest that I do see these differences in these translations over time, and that there's been a lot of fingers in the cookie jar, essentially, as this Bible has gone on. But,
I actually would agree with you, Russell, on that. I would say that was also something we agree on, is that most Christians do kind of rely on flimsy arguments because, I mean, I think that the idea that somebody is religious is, is sometimes an indicator of, religion itself is not something that develops. And I don't necessarily see this as a criticism. It's not necessarily something that develops out of critical thinking.
Okay.
I mean, so it's understandable, especially anybody who's going to be contending it and who's going to have a problem with the fact that you're an atheist. I mean, that right there is probably a sign of a certain amount of insecurity. A lot of the callers who call into this show, I was listening to some shows this week. And I mean, it sounds like a lot of them, it sounds like it's the first time that they've ever even considered any of it.
Oh, for a few of them, it definitely is. In fact, I remember like a couple months ago, this teenager from like Lebanon or something called in, and he was just kind of like, he wasn't really calling to argue for Islam, even though he was a Muslim, but mostly he was just surprised because he'd never heard of somebody who didn't believe in God before. So it's definitely true that there are some first-timers.
Yeah, and I think that, but I don't think they should be, what's happening is they're kind of being, it's hitting them in a kind of a sudden way because they haven't encountered it before, and it feels like a big defeat to them because, but it's almost, I think proof is a little bit of almost like a straw man for these people because, there's a guy on TV saying he doesn't believe in God and I can't prove that there's a God, and they kind of take to the challenge without really considering, and then I think after that it feels like a big defeat to them, whereas, I mean, it's really not an important issue. I mean, I don't think proof is an important issue on something you're trying to believe with something like religion, which has historically regards things that are kind of somewhat intangible. I mean, the idea of people not believing in God and not having faith, it goes all the way back to, so stuff like that in the Bible. It'll say there's obvious reference to people who don't believe it or think that it's foolishness or because there's never been an ability to go into a room and find God or to go to a place.
But that's not what the Bible says, so I don't know if I agree with you that people have always thought of it that way. I mean, I feel like now a lot of people think about the Bible as, a lot of them just say, oh, it's a lot of metaphor, it actually means such and such. But the Bible stories are very specific and very detailed, and they say, this happened and then this happened. And I think if you go back to a historical context, you'd actually find a lot more people who originally just believed that the stories in the Bible actually happened.
Absolutely. And in my opinion, I think some of them did happen. I don't necessarily think all of them happened, but I do think some of it's a historical reference to, things like the Babylonian captivity, or there's certain things that may or may not have happened.
I think that actually is considered by historians to have not happened.
No, the Babylonian captivity?
Wait, Babylonian captivity? Wait, I'm thinking of the Egypt stuff.
Right. No, the Egyptian captivity is
Okay.
But
sorry, wrong story. But it doesn't matter, I guess.
Right. Right. So, but I understand what you're saying. No, I would agree with that. That's not really, maybe you misread what I meant by that. There's definitely, in the Bible, it says, God parted the Red Sea or the burning bush, and that these things actually happened. What I'm saying is that along with that, even though there may have been people, Hebrews or whoever living, saying this is God and he's real and this stuff happened, I still think that it was an idea also that there were other people who didn't believe in their gods. In other words, they had to deal with the Romans who thought that their gods were nonsense or they weren't real. Or, if you look at the thing with Job, the whole idea of Job, I think, was that Job would, lose his faith or turn his back on God. So I think the idea was there that God was not something that the idea that you're supposed to believe in God was always there. The kind of the other side of that, the implication is there's people who didn't believe it. So it was not everybody believed that there was people and that there were horses and that there were trees and that there was water. But the God thing was always had this aspect to it that was somewhat intangible.
Okay, but I guess I've lost the thread of where you're going with this a little bit, because I think when you first called in, you said, well, it's not useful to talk about proof in context with religion, which we kind of agreed on.
Right.
But it seems like you're saying, it seems like what you've said since then basically amounts to, but if somebody questions your faith and you don't have an answer and you can't demonstrate some proof or evidence that God exists, then you shouldn't think of that as a defeat, but it's okay to just go on.
No, not at all.
Thinking about okay.
I would say that if you can't prove it to the extent that you have to compel that the proof is so clear that somebody would have to be insane not to believe it. In other words, like that you can prove that that ice floats on water or something like that. If you can't prove it like that, I don't think that should be a defeat. But
I'd go further than that, and I'd say that even most of the reasons that people give why it's probably a good idea to believe in God aren't that convincing if you're not starting with the assumption that it's true.
Okay. Well, I would disagree with that. I think some of them are. I think there's a lot of different people who encounter it different ways and have different experiences. I think that people go from. There are people who are raised completely as unbelievers who become religious.
And there are people who are raised in devout religious communities and say, this makes no sense, I'm done with it.
Yep.
Absolutely. But I'm saying that I would disagree that I think that you can start out from having not been indoctrinated and you can find enough of an indication that the preponderance of your data and your experience will cause you to ultimately find yourself believing that there is a God or a spiritual reality.
Well, I know it's possible, but the question is, are the reasons they're coming through to belief in God honest and valid reasons?
Exactly, and that's where it comes down to my main point, which is that when people are trying to decide that, you need to think. It's like when I look at the most important decisions that I made in my life, there are decisions that I couldn't necessarily get a lot of help with. I could think about them a lot. There is no proof one way or another, and you have to be willing to be honest with yourself. You have to be. For instance, let me give you a good example. In other words, so a common thing.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I think if you're going, it would be better to wrap up what you're thinking instead of starting in a new direction.
No. This is kind of wraps it up. So I think that if somebody thinks you need to know whether you're wanting to believe in life after death because you're afraid of dying. You need to be able to say, well, whether there's life after death or not, do you think that there is a God? Do you think there's something behind all this, and what makes it go? Do you think there's a spiritual reality? You have to only you can know whether you're being honest about those things.
Okay, and I believe
so
none of that.
Yeah, but
so where does that leave us?
You have to establish that.
Where does that leave you? It's where does it leave any individual? I mean, it leaves me. I'm a believer. You're not, and so. But I think that people who are taking these ideas into consideration need to keep that in mind, because I think that they need to not take one way or another. Atheists also. I mean, there's atheists who, they're young kids, they go to religious camp, and, you know, the Baptist preacher comes in with some heavy artillery that, you know, he's developed and puts together an attack or an argument that can make an insecure person think that there is a God, because this person dominated them and made them think that it was true. And I don't think that person should feel defeated by what appears to be a truth either. That you should take your time with it and ultimately just be honest with yourself about what you believe.
Well, I can't really disagree with what you just said. I feel like we could have disagreed if we'd gotten a little further into why you think there is a God, but I think that's not the conversation you wanted to have today.
Or even thinking about the afterlife, and it's not something that comes to my mind, because it's not, until we substantiate that a afterlife actually exists, I'm not going to sit here and live in fear of, oh my goodness, where's their afterlife? It's, why would I be afraid of something that hasn't been substantiated yet to exist at all, or even shown to even be necessarily a possibility at this point? So,
absolutely, I agree.
No reason for me to fear that at this point.
Anyway.
No, there's not. But people are afraid of that. People are just afraid of not existing.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Well, it's nice to have found so much common ground with you.
Yep.
All right.
Still think you're wrong about the God thing, but that's the way it goes sometimes.
Right back at you. Right back at you.
All right.
Got it.
I'll probably talk to you another time or something.
Awesome.
All right.
See ya.
Care.